And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and let's talk about my deck shutting down your deck, right? Or essentially matchups in the Commander format. A very important topic to talk about as far as I'm concerned, and one that I'm actually surprised I haven't talked about before, but it actually has been happening to me quite frequently in games recently, so I thought I would bring up some concrete examples of what I'm talking about here with regards to my own decks. Sometimes, regardless of what your deck is doing, the matchup you are up against is either going to be really bad for you or really good for you because your deck strategy is very much interacting with one of your opponent's strategies in sort of an inverse way, or that opponent is just doing something incidentally that happens to be hosing your deck. Now, I'm not talking about, oh, well, they played a Rest in Peace and I have a graveyard deck. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about your opponent just happens to have things in their deck that shuts you down. You should always be putting Graveyard Hate in your deck, right? No, I'm talking about you're playing a Yurlok deck, for example. I'll bring that guy up. Talked about him in my Monolith Commanders video. Also talked about him in my 5 builds video, talking about going a different direction with him. And that commander, of course, regardless of what direction you're going there with that commander, that ability of putting 3 mana into everyone's mana pool, you're going to likely want to be utilizing. And in fact, more so in the build I suggested, which was more an tapping theme, where you're using that ability over and over again, and your opponent can very easily, and again, incidentally, purely by accident, completely hose your strategy by having any mana sink in play, right? So what do I mean by a mana sink? Well, anything that they can put mana into. Helix Pinnacle being a fantastic example. If your opponent has a Helix Pinnacle in play, guess that hoses your entire deck, right? Not much you can do about that. But more specifically, a commander with a mana sink, right? If their commander has an ability they can sink mana into, wow, it's going to be really difficult for you to close out games against that person using that strategy, right? I'll use some more specific strategies that happened to me. A patron of mine has an anti-ETB deck. Very interesting deck. So what do I mean by that? Well, they got a Stoic Proctor or a Torpor Orb or something like that in play that hates on ETBs, not because they're trying to shut down everyone else's strategies, but because they're trying to shut down the downsides of their ETB creatures, right? So they got a Wormfang Manta or a Eater of Days, right? These creatures with really, really bad ETBs that they want to skip over. And so they put things like the Torpor Orb in play to make sure that they're not getting the bad ETB. But of course, if they have those things in play, it's going to affect you as well. And if you happen to be playing a deck that relies on ETBs, you're going to be shut down just incidentally because of what that player is doing, right? That happened to me in a game. Luckily for me, I wasn't playing a super devoted ETB deck, but I got an Eternal Witness and can't really play it. It doesn't do anything. It's just a 3 mana 2/1 creature, right? But of course, this all comes down to matchups. That's the important part of this conversation. If that patron happens to grab that deck, well, I'm sure not going to grab my Tishana deck because I'm probably not going to be doing a whole lot in that game. And in fact, it might even be my Rex Sage that I am relying on to get that Torpor Orb in play, which of course isn't going to work because it's going to shut down the ETB. So this is sort of a strategy that has to go into play even before the game begins, right? You're just choosing your deck based on what your other opponents are playing. I had another really interesting one with my Abishon deck recently, which of course is a deck that wants to be tapping down creatures. And in the same game, I had 2 interactions with 2 different opponents that one helped my strategy and the other one really hurt my strategy. I have a patron that has a tapping, untapping deck. That's the theme of the deck. They want to be tapping down their creatures, untapping their creatures, all that kind of stuff. And of course, with my Abishon deck, that's fantastic. You want to be tapping and untapping all your creatures constantly? Great. I'll cast my Betrayal on any of your creatures because I know they're going to be tapping and untapping a lot, and I'll draw a bunch of cards. Or maybe I'll even have my Verity Circle in play and I'll really draw a ton of cards off of what you're doing. I don't even have to put any effort into it. All I have to do is have some of my pieces in play and I'm going to gain a ton of benefit off of what you happen to be doing in your deck anyway. Conversely, in the exact same game, I was playing against another patron who had an Avacyn deck, and of course they were doing a lot of Angels in there, and of course because of that they had a lot of Vigilance there. And man, was that ever hurting me. Not only the Vigilance, but the flying creatures as well. And I had never come across this in all these years playing my Abishon deck. I guess I never played it against an Angel Tribal deck before. Flying and Vigilance, both of those are not great for my deck. Of course, the Vigilance means they're not going to be tapping their creatures, which, you know, obviously I can get around that a little bit. I do have ways to tap creatures in the deck, obviously, but the flying as well, well, of course, my commander doesn't hit flying creatures, so those two abilities combined really gives my deck a hard time. Again, I'd never even come across that before, and obviously the person who built that deck wasn't planning on hosing my deck, just incidentally because they happened to be playing Angel Tribal, they were hosing my deck without even meaning to. That's the kind of interactions I'm talking about here. Same thing happened with my Lulu deck, which now I'm sort of doing the untapping theme myself, and in recent games I realized there is two specific strategies that deck actually completely by accident works really, really good against. The first one is goading. And of course, goading really popular in the format now. A lot of people don't like it. I gotta say, I'm one of those people where I'm starting to get a little annoyed by it. And I was so glad to accidentally find out that my Lulu deck is really, really good against a goad deck. Why? Well, of course, creatures that are tapped can't attack, and I guess, again, if you're playing any of those tapping, untapping themes, this is a really easy way to get around at, right? Obviously, in that deck, I have a lot of ways to tap down my creatures because I want them to be tapped. So if someone has cast a Disrupt Decorum and goaded all my creatures, okay, well, on my turn before combat, I'll just tap down all my creatures, no problem. Now I have to just get that Revolt trigger for my commander, and then on my end step, all my creatures will become untapped, and now I got blockers for all those other goaded creatures. So that deck, purely by accident, works really, really good against a goad theme. The other strategy it happens to completely by accident work really, really good against is the forced block theme. Another patron of mine has a deck where you're playing the Nemesis Mask and the lure effects and stuff like that because you have certain creatures that you want to be blocked. It's a really great strategy that I myself have revisited a few times, right? You got an Elvish Warhounds in play. I stick that lure effect on it, attack someone, they have to block with all their creatures, and of course all those creatures will go on top of their library. Pretty fantastic play. And again, I found out playing that deck against their deck, they Nemesis masked one of their creatures, hoping to force blocks, and before blockers were declared, I just used some of my tapping devices to tap down all my creatures because of course tapped creatures can't block. So purely incidentally, by accident, I found out that my Lulu deck was pretty fantastic against both a goading theme and a force blocking theme. But if my evil twin shows up with my Abishon deck and now I'm playing in that game, well, obviously I'm going to be tapping and untapping my creatures a lot and they're going to benefit from it, right? So what I'm talking about here is you just happen to have a strategy in your deck or something you're doing in your deck purely by accident shuts down someone else's deck. It's always great to discover those things, but also, of course, the big takeaway here is the matchups. I just recently played another game where I have a patron who has a Klothys deck and I have my new Drellnu deck, which of course is wanting things in the graveyard. This is a pretty obvious one. I should not have done it, but they had their new deck they wanted to play and I had my new deck I wanted to play. So I just played it without even really thinking and realizing that they were playing a deck that has a commander with graveyard hate printed directly on it. It was my own fault, really. I just really wanted to play my new deck, and that is sort of the overarching topic here is you really need to be careful when choosing those matchups. If you got a new deck you want to play and someone's playing a deck that is clearly going to hose yours, you might want to avoid it. You could have a Rule Zero discussion and be like, hey man, I want to play my new deck that's a graveyard deck. Could you avoid playing that deck that happens to hate on graveyards or happens to hate on ETB themes because I want to play my new deck that has a lot of ETBs? Certainly a Rule Zero discussion could solve that problem. But at the same time, are you going to grab that deck that specifically hoses someone else's deck because you know that you do, right? If I'm playing someone who has one of those goad commanders, for which there is a ton now, am I going to reach for my Lulu deck because I know that my Lulu deck fares really well against goading? I guess I could. I guess it depends on who I'm playing against, whether or not I really like that person or not. It can be a little unfun if you purposely grab your deck that just happens to shut down another guy's deck. Again, Rule Zero discussions as well as playgroup discussions if you have them, right? This is one of those discussions, like most Rule Zero discussions, that if you have a playgroup, it's a lot easier to do so. It can get really tough sometimes if you have a playgroup where you happen to have a graveyard deck and every time you want to play it, the other guy in your playgroup grabs his graveyard hate deck. So then you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm not playing my graveyard deck, but when are you ever going to play your graveyard deck if they're always doing that, right? That's where it sort of gets into a sticky situation. I guess you'll have to wait until they don't show up one day. That's when you play your graveyard deck. It can be tough. I'll just say for me personally, my Dralnu deck, I had some bad luck with it. Haven't really got off to the races with it because I've had some bad matchups. So I really am, as much as I want to play that deck, there's no point if I'm not going to get a matchup that will work with that deck. So I'm just going to wait until the opportunity arises to play it again. Badly as you might want to play that new deck of yours, if the matchup isn't good, what's the point? You're probably not going to enjoy yourself anyway, right? Those matchups can be really, really important in a Commander game. Certainly can very easily decide the outcome and how much you enjoy playing your Commander decks. You guys let me know in the comments below if you have any deck that your specific strategy or what you're doing just happens to shut down other strategies in the format. Not because you were necessarily planning it that way, it just happens purely by accident. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.